feet. The first thing Mara Voss felt when she came back from the void was the smell of burning insulation and someone else's blood. She was hanging upside down in the ejection cradle, her harness cutting into her shoulders. The cockpit of her Star Knife fighter crumpled around her like a fist. Through the cracked viewport, she could see sky. Wrong sky, too purple, too low. And she understood without having to think about it that she was on the ground, which meant she had survived the section, which meant the Veth had shot her down, which meant everything else had probably gone very wrong very fast. She counted her fingers, all 10. She counted her teeth with her tongue. Most of them. He unbuckled the harness and fell the 2 meters to the ruined cockpit ceiling that was now the floor, hit it with her shoulder, and lay still for a moment listening to the ship settle and pop around. Thos. Her comms were dead, she had spoken to herself. The ship's emergency latch took 3 kicks to release. He crawled out into air that tasted like copper and wet soil and something else that she didn't have a word for. Something the Veth planets always smelled like. Animal and ancient and faintly sweet. Your way that made her stomach turn. She had been briefed on it. She had not believed the briefing. She was in the Veth's territory. Their hemisphere of the station world Karath 5. The hemisphere that humanity's compact fleet had been told for 11 years was the enemy's staging ground for genocidal expansion. He had her sidearm and 6 rounds in a combat knife that had belonged to her father. He did not have a rescue beacon because the carrier Acheron was at last comcheck, on fire in low orbit and probably no longer in a position to receive signals. Mara sat on a rock and watched the purple sky and did the math. It came out the same way twice, which was the math's way of telling her to stop doing it. She was thinking about Teo, Lieutenant Commander Teodoro Basque, her CAG, her partner of 4 years, who had ordered her to break off and she had not broken off when the Veth found her. There were 3 of them. She had her sidearm out before she consciously decided to draw it, which was a thing combat training did to a person. They were tall, the Veth. Nearly 2.5 meters, bilateral symmetry, 4 limbs, which was where the easy comparisons to humanity ended. Their skin was a deep chromatophoric gray that shifted in subtle patterns when they moved or communicated. Colors she had no names for flowing through the tissue like weather. Their eyes were compound, faceted amber, and they looked at her the way you looked at something you had never expected to see and were trying to decide what category it belonged in. He kept the gun up. Her hand was completely steady, which surprised her a little. The lead Veth, she assigned the designation arbitrarily, based on the fact that it stood slightly in front of the others, made a sound that was less a sound than a change in air pressure. Resonance in the chest cavity and the chromatophoric patterns on its skin shifted through blue-violet into something she had no reference for. It did not reach for a weapon. I know you can't understand me, Mara said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. I'm going to stay right here. You're going to do whatever you're going to do. I just want you to know that I know what this is. The lead Veth looked at her for a long time. Then it crouched down to her eye level, slowly, deliberately, the whole motion broadcasting something she read instinctively as non-aggression without being able to explain why, and it placed both of its secondary forelimbs flat on the ground, palms up. It was not a gesture from any cultural database in the compact fleet. It was not in the threat response manual, or the first contact protocol, or the 11 years of wartime intel she had been fed since she was old enough to understand words like genocide and incursion. It was something else. Something that did not belong in the story she had been told about what the Veth were. Mara did not lower her gun, but she did not fire. 3 days later she was alive, which was not something she had predicted. The Veth had not harmed her, they had not caged her. They had walked with her across 15 kilometers of their terrain, a landscape of crystalline formations and dense root forests. Nothing like the barren killing ground the compact's strategic maps showed, to something she could only call a settlement. A living structure, organic and grown rather than built, warm inside, lit by bioluminescence. They had given her water that tasted like minerals, and a fibrous food she had eaten without asking what it was because she was starving, and because her father had always said that being alive was the prerequisite for having opinions about dinner. The Veth did not try to communicate with her beyond the gesture language that had evolved between them in the field. Her nod for yes, her raised hand for stop, the lead Veth's color shift pattern she started thinking of as blue patience, which it did when she was confused or afraid, and which seemed to mean something in the neighborhood of wait, and I am here, and this is not what you think. Had started calling the lead Veth Slate in her head because of the color it went when it was thinking hard. On the 3rd night, sitting across from Slate in the glow of the settlement's inner chamber, Mara understood something that hit her like a physical blow. She had been examining the walls, which were covered in what she'd initially assumed were decorative markings, the kind of abstract organic patterning you saw in species without written language. He had been wrong. It was a record, a history, felt, and in the history, rendered in a visual grammar she was only beginning to parse, but rendered clearly enough that even a human pilot with 6 rounds and a dead comms unit could read the shape of it. It was the war, 11 years of it, and in the Veth's version they were not the ones who had started it. She sat with that for a long time. Her hand found her father's knife on her hip, not to draw it but just to hold the handle. He had given it to her on her first deployment, embarrassed about the sentimentality of the gesture, making a joke about it being primarily useful for opening ration packs. He had used it twice in combat and approximately 400 times opening ration packs, which probably would have pleased him. In her head in the dark, she heard Tio's voice, "Break off, Voss. I'm giving you a direct order. Break off." She had not broken off. He had gone back for Hendricks, whose fighter was tumbling with a dead engine, and she had caught 3 Veth rail rounds doing it and gone down herself, and Hendricks had made it back to the Acheron, and she did not know if the Acheron was still there to receive him. This was the math she kept doing and kept getting the same answer to. Break off, Voss. She never broke off. It was depending on who you asked, her defining quality or her fatal flaw, and the answer usually came down to whether you were the person she'd gone back for or the person waiting at home. She thought about the Compact's briefings. She thought about 11 years of war. She thought about the markings on the wall. She thought about Slate crouching down to her eye level with its palms flat on the ground, broadcasting something that no cultural database had a category for because the category was simply, "This is a living thing and I am a living thing and we are here." The Compact fleet believed the Veth were animals, biological threats, an extermination problem. The briefings used words like infestation and hive logic and primitive predation, and she had believed them because you believed the briefings because the alternative was a question so large it ate everything else. She was looking at the alternative now. Mara stood up and walked to the wall and put her hand flat against the history carved there, and Slate watched her, and the settlement breathed around them both in the bioluminescent dark. He still did not lower her gun. She was not naive, but she started sleeping again, which was its own kind of decision. On the 5th day, everything changed. He heard the approach signature before she saw the ships. A sound she knew from 4 years of combat patrols, the specific harmonic of Compact fleet razors in tight formation, which meant command had found her position, which meant she was being retrieved. She should have felt relief. What she felt was something more complicated. Slate heard the ships too. The entire settlement heard them, and the response was immediate and clarifying, not panic, not aggression, but a kind of braced, quiet readiness that she recognized as people who had learned what those sounds meant and had learned it the hard way. Children, she realized. There were children in the settlement. He had not registered them as children because Veth young looked so different from adults. Smaller, rounder, their chromatophoric skin still cycling through colors without the control adult Veth had, bright and chaotic. She had seen them and categorized them as creatures and had not thought further, and now she stood corrected, which was a specific kind of terrible. The razors came in low, fire suppression formation. He knew that formation because she flew it herself, and she knew what it was for, and she was outside with her sidearm up and her voice at maximum volume before she had thought through what she was doing or what it would cost her. Compact fleet, stand down. This is Lieutenant Mara Voss, Designation 7 Tango Actual. I am a rescued prisoner under Article 14. Stand down. The razors held formation, hovering, engines loud enough to feel in the sternum. She put herself directly between the lead razor and the settlement entrance and kept her sidearm raised, which was arguably the stupidest thing she had done in a career full of candidates for that. Static crackled in the emergency channel she'd switched her suit comms to. A voice she did not recognize. Lieutenant Voss, step away from the structure. Negative. I am invoking Article 14, unlawful engagement of non-combatant populations. These are civilians. They are Veth. They are children, Mara said. And I am standing here, and if you fire you will be filing a report that explains how you engaged a Compact fleet officer in a combat zone. Sir. A long silence. The kind of silence in which you could hear the shape of a decision being made. She heard Slate behind her. She did not look back. She heard the settlement. The slow bioluminescent breathing of it, and the smaller, faster sounds of children who did not know what the machines in the sky were but who were afraid. Because children were always faster at being afraid than adults were at protecting them. Her hand was completely steady. She was still proud of that. The lead razor pulled up. The formation followed, 3 seconds of agonizing non-movement, and then the harmonic shifted, and they were rising. She watched them go until they were specks in the purple sky. Then she lowered her gun and her hands were finally shaking, and she let them shake, because there was nobody here who would file a report on it. Slate touched her shoulder. That one secondary forelimb barely contact, the same gesture a person made when they were not sure if touch was welcome but felt it was worth trying. Deep. The color it shifted to was something I hadn't seen from it before. Warmer than blue patience, a deep amber that moved slowly through the chromatophores like something that had been held a long time and was only now being let out. She did not have a word for it. She made a note to find one. The compact took her back 6 days later. Dull. Unofficial extraction, no record, which she understood immediately meant that someone in command knew what she knew, and had decided that the best protocol was the one that involved her signing 17 documents about operational security and the protection of strategic intelligence. She signed them. She was good at that kind of patience now. Tio met her at the hangar on the Acheron. The Acheron was battered but not dead, held together, she was told, through a combination of engineering ingenuity and a chief engineer named Pulowski who had reportedly been awake for 60 hours. And was not accepting the premise that the ship was unable to do a thing simply because it technically could not. Theo looked at her for a long moment and then pulled her in and did not let go for a while, which was not standard protocol either. But the Acheron seemed to be operating on a liberal interpretation of protocol at the moment. I told you to break off, he said into her hair. Hendricks is alive, she said. He did not have an answer for that, neither did the 17 documents. He went back to duty. She flew her patrols. She filed her reports in the standard language using the standard categories. She was very good at appearing to be a person who had come home unchanged. In the quiet between patrols, she read everything she could access about the war's origins, the compact's official history, the strategic assessments, the casualty projections. She read between the lines, which was a skill she had developed in school and refined in combat. The art of finding the question that the document was designed to prevent you from asking. Aide was Lieutenant Commander Tessa Orlo, who finally knocked on her cabin door. Orlo, who flew second wing on the Acheron's Alpha Squadron and who Mara had always assessed as sharp and watchful and more interested in the shape of things than the compact generally rewarded you for being. I heard about your debrief, Orlo said without preamble. My debrief was classified. Yes, Orlo said. Well, Mara looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door. There were 6 of them by the end of the week. 7. Counting Pawlowski, who said he'd been suspicious of the war's accounting for 3 years and had been waiting for someone else to start being suspicious out loud. 8. Counting Teo, who said he'd been waiting for Mara specifically because he'd learned years ago that the most useful thing you could do in a losing situation was stand next to Mara Voss and try to keep up. We need to get to command, Orlo said in Mara's cabin, with the door locked and the comms shielded, not regional, central command. If we can put the documentation in front of the Admiral's Council, they'll classify it and we'll disappear, said Pawlowski. Maybe, Mara said. Or maybe we find out that command didn't know. That it's the ecclesiastical office running the conflict accounting, that the people with the authority to stop this are being fed the same story as everyone else. That's optimistic, Orlo said. I prefer insufficiently pessimistic, Mara said, and Teo made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him in a week. Getting to Central Command required leaving the Acheron without authorization, which required Pawlowski to develop a creative interpretation of the engine diagnostic that necessitated an emergency orbital insertion, which required the helmsman, Ensign Kiri Donso, 22 years old, who Mara would have trusted with her life before this and now trusted with considerably more, to execute a navigational maneuver that the compact's regulations described as inadvisable in a document that also described a great many other things the Acheron's crew had done in the past 48 hours. The Veth found them first. It was slate, or a Veth that moved like slate. She could not yet read the individual markings well enough to be certain, and she was working on it that brought the contact signal to the rendezvous frequency she had not known slate had and had not known she'd broadcast. She had not broadcasted deliberately. But the emergency channel on her suit comms had a signature specific to her unit designation, and she had been on that channel when she'd called down the razors, and apparently the Veth had better signal intelligence than the compact gave them credit for, which was perhaps not surprising, given how many other things about the Veth were not what the compact gave them credit for. The Veth wanted to talk, not fight, not negotiate in the sense of exchange of ultimatums. They had brought their own documentation, their own history, a record of the conflict that matched and in several places expanded on what Mara had read on the wall of the settlement, and what it showed, clearly, in a visual grammar she had now had 10 days to learn, was that the war was a construction, that the Veth's aggressive expansion was a story, that the ecclesiastical office of the compact and a corresponding power structure within the Veth political hierarchy had been in quiet cooperation for longer than the war itself, and that the war served them both, kept the Veth population fearful and compliant, kept the human population fearful and compliant, and kept both sets of people looking outward at the enemy instead of inward at the hands on the controls. They've been doing this to their own people too, Orlo said, looking at the data. Her voice was flat, which was what happened to Orlo's voice when she was processing something at the limit of her capacity to process. Yes, Mara said. Veth on the other side of this are the same as us. Yeah, Orlo was quiet for a moment. How long have you known? Since the wall, Mara said. I just needed the math to finish. What happened next took 2 months and is better described by the official inquiry transcripts than by Mara Voss, who was not a natural narrator of institutional processes and who gave her account to the Admiral's Council in the same flat, precise language she used for combat reports. Because she had found that was the only version they would hear without flinching, she presented the documentation. Slate's people presented theirs through the signal channel. Tio presented the engagement logs. Polthowski presented engineering analyses of weapon signatures that did not match the Veth's known arsenal, which was a detail the Compact's own intelligence division had buried in a footnote from 8 years ago. The council flinched anyway. That was all right. The flinching was the beginning. The ecclesiastical office did not go quietly. Orlo had predicted this. Mara had predicted this. It did not make it easier. There were 4 months of what the official record called civil instability, and the people living through it called something worse. And during those 4 months, Mara flew more sorties than she had in 2 years of combat, not against the Veth but alongside them, a thing that required an entirely new set of formation protocols and the kind of improvised trust building that had no manual, only the day-by-day accumulation of evidence that the thing you were doing was worth doing. Slate flew. She had not known that. She had not known that the Veth had something she would call a pilot's instinct, the same quality she recognized in Teo, in Orlo, in herself, the part of the brain that went quiet in a cockpit, that thought in vectors and windows, that was more fluent in 3-dimensional space than in language. He had learned to read Slate's color shifts in combat the way she'd learned to read Teo's body language on the bridge. She was still learning. That was fine. Learning was a process she had made her peace with. The thing that ended it. Not the war, which had already ended by then as a formal matter, but the last engagement, the last holdout of the ecclesiastical fleet against the combined compact Veth force, was not a grand maneuver or a strategic masterstroke. It was Polowski who had been awake for an implausible number of hours again, telling Mara on an open channel that the enemy fleet's communications were running through a routing hub that was also powering their point defense grid, which meant that knocking out comms would take down the shields, which meant that all she had to do was put a signal spike through a frequency window that had a 3-second cycling gap, and he walked her through the calculation in real time while she flew the approach, and she hit it on the first pass. He hit it on the first pass because she was the best pilot in the compact fleet, and possibly, according to Tio, in several adjacent fleets, and because she had not broken off in 11 years, and some things about a person do not change regardless of what they learn about the world. The fleet stood down, the council broadcast. In the quiet afterwards, in her cockpit, she let out a long breath that she felt like she had been holding for 2 months, or 4 years, or 11, depending on how you counted. Her comms crackled. A color-based signal, translated through the new joint protocol Orlo's team had been building for 6 weeks. The amber wavelength she had learned on the 5th day, in a settlement on Karathor, the one he had spent 10 days finding a word for. She had settled on gratitude, but it was bigger than that. It was the thing before gratitude, the wordless thing, the one that moved slowly through you like it had been held a long time and was only now being let out. She broadcast back the same frequency. It was the only honest response she had. Then she pointed the Stark knife at open space and let herself go fast, just for a moment, just for the clean animal pleasure of velocity, the way she had the first time she'd ever flown and understood that this was the thing she was for. The Akron was 3 minutes away. Teo was on the bridge. Polowski was probably already asleep, finally in the engine compartment. He had 6 rounds in her sidearm and her father's knife on her hip and a war that was finally over. The math came out right for once. She counted it twice to be sure.